Uh, yeah, I prepared some slides. Just show the screen. Mhm. Okay. Uh, just share the screen because if we need to use Figma or something, it's easier to bring in. Can you guys see this? Can you guys read it? Okay. Yeah. So just some preface to this to make it so that it makes more sense. I think there are two pieces of context that are relevant. The first is that we gave a presentation, again, Rafael, myself, Victor, and Fernanda, a couple of weeks ago, about this project that we're running here in Rio called the Common Space of Organizations. And the development we're presenting today is something that makes more sense in the context of that project because, I mean, you can see the presentation to get like a fuller picture, but basically it's been about, I don't know, since November or October last year, we've started developing the space where we meet once a week. It's open for people to join. And we do this cycle of different activities. We have a theoretical seminar one week, then the next week, we do this thing we call a militant inquiry, where we welcome a different organization. We invite them to speak a bit about their political experience. And then the third week, we have an open debate about the seminar and the inquiry, right? So trying to mix two things together. It's at first it wasn't an idea, a project just to test STP's ideas. So we want to present them and have a theoretical dialogue. And then once we welcome an organization, a guest organization, the idea was to see if these ideas have purchased with what they have to say about their experience, their difficulties and problems. But as the thing started to happen and to gain some traction and so on, the question of, okay, but what does it mean to welcome these different organizations? What does it mean to listen to these people and like all the things that actually are involved in creating the space for that type of activity? We started wondering exactly what we meant by this idea of militant inquiry, and we started theorizing a bit more about it in that space. So all the seminars, the theoretical seminars for the last month or so, have been about this theory, going over the history of what's actually usually called workers' inquiries, discussing what was the function of different attempts at using workers' inquiry in different political movements, and then trying to lead to our own like being a bit clearer about what we're doing, our own conception, even if just as a partial attempt at summarizing it. So we presented a bit about that project a couple of weeks ago, the Common Space of Organization, just gave an idea of how it works, what its purpose, how it's been this far. And we had planned this follow-up meeting that would be a more theoretical meeting specifically about the activity of doing the inquiries themselves, what's at stake in those inquiries, how we understand them in light of the theory that we've been developing in STP. So I think that's the main context for the presentation to make sense. The second part of the context, which is relevant for people who haven't been following STP, is that we're currently writing a book trying to summarize some of our partial kind of research results. We're in talks with Verso about a possibility of publication. And we have a plan for the book structure. And the book kind of concludes the current structure, at least one of the points of the last chapter. So it's meant to be a sort of culmination or condensation of many of the previous points we want to make, is the theory of militant inquiry. So there is a convergence between what we're doing in this project here in Rio, in Brazil, and kind of theoretical contributions we're trying to develop more generally. So in this presentation and the way I structured it, I tried to connect these two things, even though connections are still very loose. We don't assume these things to be kind of ready or done, but it is, let's say, at least a good testing ground and a starting point for some of these ideas. Hopefully, we can, get a better sense from the conversation today of where to take it. So everything is very kind of nascent still, right? We propose, I mean, I'm kind of driving the presentation, but Rafa, just interrupt me whenever you feel like it. But anyway, like we decided to divide it into 6 points. Some of them are quite quick, and others could lead to a longer conversation. And I shared with you on our Discord channel, but also on our website. So as the meeting materials, a short text. There's just a summary of the discussions we've had at CSO about the workers' inquiry. So I'm going to make like a very brief summary of what we call like some lessons from the study of the workers' inquiry. I just wrote down a couple of points, like key points to pay attention to. But in the summary I linked to the meeting, you can get like a 5-page discussion of these lessons. So they might make more sense than what I can summarize right now, right? But we spent some time in these meetings when we were trying to introduce and discuss the theory of militant inquiries, just reading through a lot of the material on the workers' inquiry, right? There is this famous questionnaire designed by Marx, right, which is called a workers' inquiry. It has, I think, 100 questions that he sends to, I think, French workers, about 20,000 copies. I don't remember anymore, but a bunch of these questionnaires were sent around. You can find them online very easily. So we started discussing the questionnaire, which is something like a lot of different political movements return to and try to reinterpret the questionnaire. Was it a failure? Was it a success? What does it say about the role of, the knowledge of workers in the critique of political economy and so on? So we discussed Marx's inquiry. We discussed Lenin's different positions with regards to the workers' inquiry. He was in favor of it early on. Then later on, he said they're pretty much bullshit. You can only get very specialized and particular knowledge out of these investigations. We discussed, I'll leave Mao for a second because it's, as I said, there's a bit of an exception with Mao, but we discussed the recuperation of the inquiries with the Johnson Forest tendency in the States after the war. The way that they mediate the recuperation of the inquiries for Europe, because the Clos Lefort and Castoriadis Trotskyist group, right? So socialism or barbarism, I don't know how, Barber, they translate some of the texts from the Johnson Forest tendency, and they discuss and they rework the idea of an inquiry. They create a journal that publishes workers' narratives, both the Johnson Forest tendency as well as the Socialismo Barber group. They both criticize the idea of using a questionnaire. They prefer narratives. Then they both influenced the Italian autonomists, who really kind of championed the idea of workers' inquiry as part of their politics. This is then kind of contrasted to the way that a more Maoist inclined idea of inquiry is absorbed by French Maoists. We also discussed a sort of theory of the inquiry that appears from within a Catholic action movement. In Brazil, it was very strong in the 20s, 30s, and all throughout the 20th century, ultimately leading to a very particular way that Mao Zedong and his idea for investigations are absorbed by Paulo Freire and in a kind of pedagogical theory of peasant education. So we discussed a bunch of these different ideas. We discussed a recent text by Notes from Below, who tried to give a kind of comprehensive account of what is workers' inquiry, how the problem of social composition features in it. So all these things I discussed in some detail in this summary that I linked on. I can probably link it here as well. But you can find it on. Let me just see if I can add the file here. Yeah, here. If you want it, it's like it's also a Google translation of a Portuguese version, so it's not perfect, but it's readable. So, but anyway, don't want to go into that too much. These are just some key points that we ended up discussing and focusing on when, like, as a kind of things that were sedimented from all those discussions, right? So the first point is that there is something that qualifies the idea of an inquiry that distinguishes it from research or from some sort of just social investigation or something like this, which is the fact that, okay, you start from the idea that you don't know something you want to know, right? There is a lack of knowledge, there's some ignorance that the inquiry wants to mitigate, wants to do away with, but that lack of knowledge is constituted by a political process. So it, for example, even in Marx's inquiry, which is probably the most kind of scientific of all, in the sense that the questions are very objective, they concern work conditions in factories, how many accidents have there been in your factory, how many limbs have been, cut off at your work place, are there exits, how many exits there are for workers in case of an emergency, and what are the chemical pollutants that are most common in your environment, things like that, which sound very sociological in terms of analysis. And you could find this today in many people who are just studying, I don't know, production engineering or something like this. The question that the place where politics appears there as constituting the questions and the ignorance that he's trying to mitigate is the very selection of these questions, because you could have thousands of different questions to ask, all of them concerning very objective things, but why these are the concerns and not others, and why are these questions addressed to these people rather than other people? That's not something you could define simply by curiosity or because it's always good to know everything about everything or something like this. Clearly there is a political direction that comes from the First International, from the workers' movement. There is a conviction that the workplace is a particularly important site for political struggle, that the demands for improvement of work conditions is a very important political demand, and that frames the questions that are asked. So even though you might say that it is, well, it's so objective, clearly it's not a subjectively induced, subjectively engaged assessment or investigation. In fact, it is, because there's something about the idea of class, there's something about the idea of selecting where to focus your energies at, which is not just derived from empirical analysis. You're doing empirical analysis because there's something you are already committed to. So we focused a lot on this idea that there is something about the lack of knowledge, something about the ignorance that is at stake in a workers' inquiry, and it's meant to be thought through, which is doesn't stem from a research question or a scientific question. It stems from a political engagement. You can't really do away with that, because that does qualify a bunch of the problems that are kind of at stake in the form of the workers' inquiry. And one of the ways of understanding why it being a matter of politics is a relevant qualification is because if it was a matter of just social studies, it would be okay to say that you're different from the people you are investigating, from the work environment or the social group that you're interested in. But when this lack of knowledge is political, when this ignorance is politicized, it means that below the difference, below the distinction or the separation between whoever's asking and whoever's answering, there is some level of commonality. right? There is a sameness. Otherwise, you wouldn't want to know those things. You only want to know those things either because you want to be there and act together, because you consider them to have a relevant political place that affects you and everyone. So there is a tension in the workers' inquiry, because you need, if there wasn't a difference, if there wasn't a separation, you wouldn't try to learn more about the situation because you would already know what's going on. But you need to maintain that there is a commonality or a sameness to this process. Otherwise, it wouldn't be part of your political process. It simply wouldn't be interesting, right? So there is a tension between how far you are from others and how close you are to others, right? And how you navigate that tension is clearly a point of concern for a lot of militants and movements who try to implement workers' inquiries with strategic use. Another thing we discussed, which actually in our first meeting discussing militant inquiries here, when we welcomed, I think, Marcelo Hoffman, who came to present on his book, which is a history of militant inquiries called Militant Acts. One thing that we discussed back then, which is very relevant to this dialectics of proximity and distance, is that there is a connection between meeting and inquiry. If you take meetings to be the kind of the basic form of politics in the sense of people being together, doesn't need to be in presence, doesn't need to be at the same time and place, but they are meeting means that they have some encounter within which they share a common kind of position, right? To discuss, to decide, or whatever. Well, you only have inquiries because you can't have meetings. If Italian autonomists were having meetings regularly with the Italian workers from certain car factories, they wouldn't do inquiries with those workers because they would already have the information that they need, because they would be part of the movement. So there is another way of thinking about this tension that the political dimension of inquiries creates, is just to think that inquiries are meetings through another means, in a certain sense. Because when you have the meetings, you don't need the inquiry, right? So there is something that is continuous, something strange that has a certain continuity between meeting to discuss, to share, to decide, and the inquiry. It's like you're fleshing out, or you're spreading into several steps a process that happens all at once in a meeting, something like this. Or you might even say you try to mitigate the lack of meeting by creating the inquiry, right? This is again relevant for us because we will see that there's only one kind of theory of inquiries that focuses on the meeting rather than on the question, which is Mao Zedong's theory. But we'll leave it at our side. What we saw is that most versions of the workers' inquiry are produced by political movements that are trying to stay at a distance from the state. So examples of this, after Marx's original inquiry, where I think things are very ambivalent. Marx is not just doing inquiries with workers, he's also using reports from state inspectors and factories for capital and things like this. He's clearly had a very polymorphous kind of relation to different sources of information about the world of labor. But if you look after him, Lenin, the moment that the state is in view, having state power becomes a possibility, he's already less inclined to use this type of inquiry and more inclined just to trust official data about factories, workers, and so on. So you can see that in the end of the 1900s, the end of the 19th century, he is the development of capitalism in Russia, he's using inquiries to come up with information about how capitalism works in Russia. After the turn of the century, especially 5-10 years into the 20th century, he's already saying that this thing is not really as good for the type of politics that he needs to engage with. So it's a counterexample of somebody who is thinking Marxist politics with the state, with the transformation of the state, so not around the state. And at that point, he drops the idea of the workers' inquiry. Then if you think about the Johnson Forest, Socialismo Barber, the Italian autonomists, and this kind of tradition, which I think you can kind of lump it all together in a certain way, you will see that the Americans were Trotskyists who were trying to critique the Soviet state. Socialismo Barber was a Trotskyist group with autonomist tendencies trying to rethink the relation with the party and the state due to what was coming to light about the Soviet state as well. The Italian autonomists were criticizing like a whole series of political apparatuses going from trade unions to the party to the state itself, because it seemed like all these different instruments were actually already codified by the state. So every time a political demand of workers entered that circuit, it would tend to be diverted, and what was the struggle for autonomy would become a heteronymous struggle where things would be imposed from the top down and so on and so forth. So again, you see the use of inquiries coming as a sort of substitute mediation, right? The state would provide a mediation that is like workers can see themselves by engaging with the state, but in doing that, something gets lost, something gets perverted. Well, if you create a journal, if you create the practice of inquiry, militants are then helping workers to see themselves, to politicize themselves, to think through their commonalities, their shared struggles, without the mediation of the state. So it played an organizational role of substituting the state very often. So why do we call Mao Zedong an exception to this? Because of these two previous characteristics. The first is, I think the core text about inquiries from Mao, even though it's actually a late text compared to the practice of investigations, as he called them, in China. I mean, Mao Zedong does like a 6-month investigation of the peasants in province of Hunan in 1916, if I'm not mistaken, 17, perhaps it's 27, I forget now. But anyway, and only in 37 you get the famous text Against the Cult of Books, where he will claim if you have not investigated a problem, you have no right to speak, right? The famous meme. But the text is pretty curious, because you have all the common motivations for an inquiry. You have Mao talking about, well, we don't know the composition of classes in China. We know little about the place we want to intervene at. We need to know more. So you get that lack of knowledge created by politics. But then what you get as a sort of explanation of the investigation runs two lines of argument that are not that common. The first is, well, you need to know how to investigate, because if you don't, you're gonna trust too much political hierarchy. If you don't know something, you will just blindly trust your leader or blindly trust whoever is above you in a hierarchy and just do what they tell you. So investigations play a role of questioning a certain hierarchy, where just because you're above somebody in a political structure, that doesn't mean you know better, right? And second is that in criticizing that and criticizing a type of idealist intellectuality just wants to learn everything from books, which is connected to that description of the hierarchy, he claims that the practice of investigations is a practice of organizing fact-finding missions, fact-finding meetings, right? So it's a meeting practice. Not only that, he claims that to investigate is to set up meetings. He tells you how those meetings might have to be. Like, you shouldn't invite like people who want to speak, who are used to speaking. You should invite like older people who have had a chance to think things through. You shouldn't trust what people tell you just because they live there. There should be other ways of assessing what is a fact and what is not. And then he adds this one statement that I think it's pretty out there compared to what you regularly find in workers' inquiries, which is to say, well, to investigate a problem is to solve a problem. It's a strange formulation because most of the time in the discussions about workers' inquiry, you get the feeling that inquiries are meant to produce a situation of knowledge that will lead to a situation of action, right? You're meant to either know the other so you can interact. For example, Marx wants to know the conditions of factories, so some action can be taken. Or people should know themselves, workers should know themselves through the inquiries. It's a self-reflexive operation so that it leads to action later on, politicization, organization, so on and so forth. But in Mao's case, action comes first and knowledge comes after. You solve a problem, that is how you learn about the problem, right? So we find these three characteristics here, right? It's a meeting, it's solving problems so you can know a problem. So that caught our attention because we work with this thing we call organizational Trinitarianism, right? Which is this idea that to look at things organizationally means to think that these three questions are three sides of the same question. How things are composed tells you something about what they get to interact with, and what they get to interact with conditions what counts, what exists, or what makes a difference for that particular structure, which in turn will also define how it can compose and create and build more structure or change and so on. So how an organization is composed, what it gets to interact with, and what is made intelligible to that organization, these are three sides of the same question. And you can see these three sides coming together in Mao's description of investigation. To meet up, meaning who gets to compose that meeting, affects which problems will appear, right? And how you interact with the problems that appear. And this tells you something about the problem. So it's an exception because it has this kind of a slightly more fleshed out idea of what's going on, which in our position, in our opinion, is not clear with the workers' inquiry very often. Very often, they only focus on this bottom structure. You want to make things clear so that you can interact, intervene, and so on, right? And the problem of composition is often an embarrassing problem. It's where the issue of, are we meeting together or are we meeting as different people? Are we the same or are we different? Well, if we're the same, why are we doing the inquiry? But if we're different, doesn't that create a problem for the inquiry? Like, how are we not like the state? How are we not like trade unions? How are we a different type of mediation, right? We'll get back to that problem in a bit. But so it seemed like the Maoist discussion of inquiries was different. But still, I mean, another reason why it was different is that the Maoist inquiry, it doesn't have a problem. Like, it still has a function even once you have state power, because you can find direct continuity between the critique of hierarchy and the critique of kind of abstract intellectuality and power in that text, and the later texts on the Cultural Revolution and the need to shift the weights of power within the Communist Party towards the peasants, towards the people, and re-educate the intellect, right? Now, of course, you can discuss like how successful that idea was, and that leads us to something that remains a problem even in the Maoist account, which is that something we saw very clearly in this recent text by Notes from Below, but it's clearly a problem throughout the whole discussion of workers' inquiry, which is that generally inquiries have this underlying problem. Let's just see if I can. Perhaps not a problem, but they have this kind of qualitative distinction that they can't really undo between transparency and opaqueness, in the sense that generally you think of something like this. You have a political group and you have a social group, and the political group is inquiring the social group. How do you know the difference between the two? The political group knows itself more, it's more conscious. It's conscious political action. Whereas the social group is partially aware of what it is, but it might not be totally aware of what it is. And what the inquiry wants to do is to create this arrow here, because politicizing is the same as raising consciousness to some level, right? Either to bring them closer to where you are, to allow them to politicize themselves in some way. But regardless, there is a qualitative distinction between these two sides. There is more transparency on this side. I don't know how to write this word, whatever it is, and more opacity here, right? Well, it doesn't matter how much you turn around the game and say, well, but it's, you know, the Maoist investigation is doing away or inverting this arrow. Well, it still can play with the fact that you can always point the group that is not transparent or reflexive enough, right? That there's some learning to do. It should be sent to the fields to do work, or it should be sent to self-critique because it's not fully kind of in line. So even though it's quite distinct from the other kind of models of doing this type of inquiries, and it has a very surprising kind of twist to that model, it still keeps that distinction between one side of the equation is qualitatively different from the other, right? So, what are we trying to do? What is the kind of underlying motivation for the idea of militant inquiry? It's because, well, we work with this thesis, which we call the organizational point of view, right? It's derived from Bogdanov, but we've been working on it in our own terms. But one of the things that are fundamental about this thesis is this idea that there is no such thing as a completely disorganized process, right? So the idea that you could, for example, oppose organized politics to disorganized politics, or politics is organized while social life is disorganized, you shouldn't be able to make those distinctions. So the organizational perspective, it starts to do away with that type of qualitative distinction between the political and the social, or the right political action versus bad political action, right? So the first thing that this idea of there being no complete disorganization implies is that all politics is organized in some way. But when something looks disorganized to you, it's most likely because you don't have the means to understand how it is organized, right? And secondly, the difference between social and political organization, given that, well, if everything is organized in some way, people's social lives need to be understood as a type of organization. Your party form is just another type of organization. But to tell apart if something is just, let's say, merely social organizing, or if something is political organizing, you can't really look at what people are saying. You need to look at how they organize and the effects of that organization. So it becomes a matter of, let's say, different structures, which are homogeneous, they're all forms of organization, and what effects they produce. We can have the situation where groups that don't think of themselves as political produce political effects, while other groups that think they are extremely political produce absolutely no political effects. So we want to be in a position to claim that the former is more political than the second, or the former is also political, at least, right? So that is those premises, they challenge that underlying distinction between who questions and who answers in the workers' inquiry. The idea that there is a political questioning of a social group, because as we said, well, in some sense, you can't tell these things beforehand. So that leads us to change perhaps how you frame the idea of an inquiry. So instead of thinking of an inquiry as the encounter of a political and a social organization, you can conceive of militant inquiries as we conceive the investigation as the political encounter between two organizations. So politics is qualifying the type of interaction rather than one of the organizations. You can have a political encounter between two organizations that don't see themselves as political, or an organization that sees itself, two organizations that do see themselves as political. That doesn't matter so much, right? The parameter that is of interest is actually the quality of the interaction between the two groups itself, and not the way that each of these groups describe themselves, right? So, for example, just to give an example, in the case of what we're doing here in Brazil, our list of guest groups that we are welcoming includes both groups that see themselves as, Popular Revolutionary Action Group, the Workers' Party, but it also includes like communitarian schools for preparing people for undergraduate exams, or people who clean houses of people who are depressed. Things that these people don't necessarily conceive what they're doing as, have the same quality as a political party, right? So we're going to try to flesh out what this means today. That's pretty much the core of the presentation. But one thing we can already say is that it is kind of the suspension of the principle that transparency is on the side of political groups and opacity is a social category, right? From the standpoint of the militant inquiries, we cannot tell beforehand where practice and thinking diverge in an organization. So what this means, for example, one example is a group often will think that because it is a political movement, that it's not also solving problems of a social nature. For example, the contradiction between the militant work that people do and their actual day jobs. There are contradictions there they need to engage with. So that might disappear from the way a political organization presents itself. So because you don't assume that organizations are transparent to themselves, you are kind of, you can conceive situations where you might find those concerns that were left outside of the organization coming back as meaningful parts of their structure, right? Or the inverse, you can find out that groups that describe themselves as being just, social activities like organizing, a football group for playing football like in the weekends, and you see who gets to come, how things are guaranteed, and so on. And they are actually working through political problems more than someone else. The same, for example, for religious groups, for instance. So that's the first point, that you suspend the idea that political organizations, what they have to say about themselves, properly describe what they do. They might do things, practice things that are very different from how they think about it. It also suspends the principle in the inverse, which is, it might be the case that some groups that don't conceive themselves as political might recognize that they are actually facing political problems already, right? And the idea is that the encounter does not produce these new distinctions only for the groups that you are inviting. It also produces that same redistribution of intelligibility, right? Some things that were opaque might become more clear. Some things you just find out they were opaque and you didn't even know. That change happens on both organizations during the inquiry, right? That's why we're calling it an encounter. Sorry, just one second. Okay, so that idea of listening to someone else with the expectation or with the under the hypothesis that there are things they do or know that they might not know, right? That there is a disjunction, a division in a subjective process, or in a on a structure, or on some organizational situation. We think that there are three very famous discourses about that type of unconscious knowledge or structural dimension of people's relations, or three discourses on the structure of social relations that take place behind people's back, right? Psychoanalysis, ethnography, and political analysis. And one thing that we were discussing, this is an idea that Rafael introduced a long time ago. In fact, I think it's more than a year ago. We started discussing this, but we didn't move forward very much with this discussion. Is that if you look at each of these three discourses, they do share this idea that, well, there is a point of view you can occupy that helps to divide the representation of what people say from the structure of what they do, right? But what we realized is that each of these tends to fit into just a section of our Trinitarian problem. So none of them really end up asking organizational questions in our sense of organization. They tend to ask like distorted questions. So we can go very quickly over each one of them. So for example, psychoanalysis tends to privilege the connection between composition and interaction. That's what we call transference. Transference in psychoanalysis is the idea that you enter into a relationship with a person, and because that relationship gains certain properties, for example, they enact with regards to you a certain form of relation that has to do with, that's a repetition of other things they do in their lives, you get to intervene on that really existing relation, right? It needs to take place, it needs to happen during the clinical process so that you can interact on it, intervene on it. Otherwise, analysis wouldn't work. That's why transference, which is just another name for what is the relation you enter with the patient, it is a condition for interaction. And at the same time, you're only going to enter in relations with your patient that lead to interaction. But that's usually thought at the expense of intelligibility. So for example, if you read analytic theory, it's pretty much crap. And I'm an analyst, so I'm allowed to say these things, because you have a problem. You tend to preserve the concreteness of that experience. You need to add a bunch of kind of prohibitions at the level of theory or at the level of the transmission of that knowledge. So for example, you need to convince analysts that every case is different, therefore you shouldn't create like a manual on how to handle cases. Or you will get like French psychoanalysts like Jacques Lacan saying, well, but the core of the theory is that there is no theory. So the most embarrassing of these three poles, the place where some metaphysical problems or fetishistic problems appear, is the pole of intelligibility. So for example, you will have like an idea that there is an otherness that you need to preserve at the level of what you say and think. At the level of composition and interaction, you have a lot of freedom. At the level of what you say and think, you need to be very careful as an analyst not to overstep. Political analysis, on the other hand, clearly centered on intelligibility and interaction. So as we were saying, in the case of most militant inquiries, but like conjuncture analysis is also a different type of text that also has this structure. You want to make things intelligible. You want to clarify the situation. You want to show that there's something structural behind mere representation, opinion, and so on, so that we can intervene, so that we can push further socialist strategy and politics. And the embarrassing pole, the embarrassing side of the equation tends to be composition. For example, in the problem of inquiries, as I was saying, well, I need to make things intelligible so we can intervene. But would you even be having that problem if you were truly organized with the people who you want to rally for political means? Like, if you were part of that process, probably you wouldn't need the thing you're doing. So there is also a certain fetishization that can happen at the level of composition. So you might, for example, just as psychoanalysts fetishize the singularity that needs to be protected by theory, political analysis tends to fetishize who gets to compose and who cannot compose together. So don't mix those people with those people, because that might get in the way of the political process, right? Yeah, Rafa.
Yeah, I wonder if just like going from where you were saying before, I think the problem of composition is also present in the issues raised by the notes from below discussion, because it seems that like there is a problem of composition from the moment where you establish this difference between those who know, those who don't know, those who seek to raise that asymmetrical structure. It seems to also present embarrassing problems, uh, if we take into account the goals of political analysis.
Yeah, it's a good point. Exactly. So, I think this actually has a lot of. We're adding examples here, but I think we could find a lot of different examples of things that fit this, and it would be nice to see if examples that fit one of these three positions, if they do have some similarity amongst them. This really does help us classify things. And then just to move faster, like there's a third point, which is actually perhaps the one we started thinking about. I think, Rafael, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's where we started with the issue, which was how is workers' inquiry and militant inquiry is different from ethnography, in fact. Because ethnography is this kind of anthropological practice that privileges composition and intelligibility, right? It says, well, you need to get close to people, understand how they are structured, understand how they organize, to understand how they think. And the politics of ethnography is very much connected with transmitting and making known the ways that different people think, right? But the embarrassing pole, the extremity where you get most fetishism, is usually the pole of interaction, like the injunction against not trying to become native in the places where you are doing ethnography. The problem of, if there is an ethical problem in the theory of epistemic cringe, exactly, John. The cringe pole is interaction here. Like, yes, look at how these people organize, and that's why they see the world in a certain way rather than another. That's why they structure their categories in one way or another. But you are a foreigner there. You shouldn't forget that fact. And that should limit how you interact. So psychoanalysts tend to fetishize knowledge in the sense of don't know too much that might fuck everything up. Political analysis tends to fetishize composition, like don't compose in the wrong way. That will actually be, much worse than doing nothing. Ethnographers tend to fetishize interaction. Like that's where things should really, you need to be careful and not to fall into some type of trap, right? But then you could ask yourself, okay, but fine, all these different groups or discourses, they try to produce kind of accounts of this structural dimension that takes place behind people's back in some level, but they all fail to account for these three levels. So what manages to account for all these levels at once? Well, that's pretty much what we call social forms in S2P's theory, right? When we talk about gift exchange, when we talk about the logic of property or the logic of value, we're talking about things or about kind of matrices for interaction, which manage to get these three things together very, 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 in a very integrated way. So, of course, we don't have time now to go in detail into the theory, but if you've been following like some of the developments we've been trying to work on, and I'll get back to them in a bit. But the idea is that, well, value is a way of prescribing how parts of the world get to interact, how they can compose with each other, what are the available ways of composing, and what will be intelligible, what will make a difference for those organizations if they are composed in a certain way. So if you have a certain group of suppliers, if you are structured with a certain group of employees, if you have a certain competitive sector you're inserted in, that will tell you what is meaningful and what is not, meaning what are the information that you should pay attention to and react to, right? And that's directly connected with how you are composed as an organization, which is itself describing or is almost equivalent to the type of things you get to interact with. Right? And of course, we're saying that this is valid for each one of these three modes of interaction, right? Or intercourse, affinity logic or kinship and gift logic, property, contracts, social pacts logic, and value logic, capital, money, and so on. And of course, ultimately, these things are composed together into actual social forms, which are a mixture of these three things. But it opens up the fact that, for example, when you get, I don't know, Hayek discussing price as a coordination mechanism, what he's talking about is also the fact that you do get a form that is allowed to mediate between people in a way that tells you what is meaningful and what is not, what based, let's say, conditioned on how prices and economic structures are composed. So why is this relevant for us? First, because it shows that it's not that this is a challenge that has no answer. It has no answer on the more leftist side of the equation, right? Because social forms and social discourses that are, let's say, produced on top of those social forms, they are precisely trying to solve this problem of producing a way of navigating that triadic structure, right? And it sets up the problem for inquiries, meaning militant inquiries are trying to establish the minimal form, right, for the cohesion between left, minimal form of cohesion between parts of the left's political ecology. So when we say that we want to find what is the shape of an investigation or a militant inquiry, and that it should have these three things in view, and it should be built so that it can integrate these three levels without fetishizing any of them, right? What you're doing is actually setting up the problem of militant inquiries in the broader domain, but then again, in which sense? But in the broader domain of issues of coordination and kind of mapping and composition and clarifying, or building power to organize, right? In a certain sense, building power to organize or to interact, intervene, mapping the social space, and composing together, right? These are, in the most minimal form, what's at stake in an investigation. And in the most extreme form, what's at stake in socialist planning, problems of large-scale economic coordination, and so on. So we're trying to set up a sort of continuity between that minimal problem and this very, very far away large problem on the other side, right? One thing that I only realized because of something Renzo said in our sorry, yeah, I'll continue later.
Please finish. I'll
Yeah, I was going to move to the next slide. So
no, yeah, I was just gonna say that I think that when we look at this triadic, the organizational trinitarianism, and the fact that we are looking at the inquiry in terms of this structure, I think it's very important to remind. I think this will be something that can be discussed, like when we talk about the forms of investigation and the examples and how we've been experimenting it. But I think it's important to emphasize how the knowledge, there's a tendency, I think, in the history of, except for the Maoist exception, as Gabriel pointed out, there's a tendency of overemphasizing the intelligibility pole due to the fact that there is a problem of mapping, and a mapping which is either trying to build power structures, etc., or compositions or alliances. And I think the point, one of the main points that we are experimenting, I think self-consciously at a certain level, is the fact that there is no intelligibility without experimental composition and experimental interaction. And I think that, in a sense, there's nothing that we can think about the situation that can be disconnected from how we are able to compose with other groups, and how these interactions develop. So I think this is very important, because in a certain sense, and I think this is like where Gabriel was maybe going with the next slide. I think it's very important to highlight how actually the inquiry is, in a sense, in itself, a political mediation, in our sense, in the sense we've been discussing, in the sense that going between a mediation that is involved in constructing a sort of what is it? Political ecology. Sorry, mixed up the translation terms. So I think that this is something that, in a sense, it's a new terrain, but also I think it's more than a new terrain that we've been developing. It's the refocusing of some discussion that we've already been happening. We've already been happening when we try to understand the difference between social mediation, political mediation, relations between political mediations and political ecologies. And this is something that's been coming up in our own, in the practical attempt to deal with like the results of our inquiries, which are not only, as like I was trying to say, which are not only intelligible results, but which in a certain sense points us into certain demands, certain tasks, certain actions that cannot be reduced to a certain knowledge, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure if I can follow, but maybe the question is a little bit misplaced. But as far as I understand it, I like first of all I like the approach that seems very holistically, that seems very holistic. But do I understand it correctly that basically you say, okay, hey, you use the militant inquiry as kind of like your methodology of trying to cover all of these polls, all of these tasks that like no other approach could cover beforehand. Like that's the holistic solution, so to say. Am I right in understanding it that way?
I would just distinguish, because I mean it's different to say nobody is doing something, because I think it's the opposite. I think everybody is doing this all the time. The issue is there a theory of the thing that most people already do? That's the thing that's missing, not necessarily a political line or a method, right? I mean, the idea is that it might make more sense to look at some things as investigations or inquiries, because that might highlight more of the relevant things that people are doing, things that actually are meaningful, than to focus on those three other approaches. But it's not a proposal for a practice necessarily, because that practice already exists all the time everywhere, right? I mean,
Okay.
generally with STP, we don't tend to propose what people should do, because there's a lot of stuff already happening, right? There is this idea from, I mean, of course, good ideas can appear, but there is this good one-liner from that Gunther Anders fella, where he said, like, we used to, what's the line, Rafa? We used to, you used to not be able to do the things that we imagined. These days, we can't imagine the things that we do. And I think that has something to do with this type of theory, right? A lot of these things we already do, but we can't even imagine what we're doing. Yeah, exactly. We used to be unable to accomplish the things we imagine. Yeah. So I don't think you need to approach this in terms of everyone is wrong. Now we're going to get it right, and now the good politics will come. Even though, of course, the more tools you have to follow up with the things you're already doing, the greater the chance they will work out, I imagine. But that's different from expecting this to give you the direction, right? On the contrary, I think a lot of the work we do has more of a sense of a second order type of action, where given that people do a lot of things, And
Hmm.
given that the tendency, and this is part of our own analysis of the political situation, given that a lot of things cancel each other out or simply don't converge, because the social situation today is one where of great fragmentation, there is no clear one direction for everything. There is a second order problem, which is you might even have good politics, but you might the sum of a lot of interesting political things might be the canceling of these things rather than the accumulation of power. So being able to track what everyone is doing and then finding ways to combine these political movements and processes and so on, that's more where our prescriptive efforts are at this kind of compositional problem. But most of what we
Okay,
have
no,
to say about politics, does that make sense?
Okay, no, then I slightly misunderstood it. Thanks for the clarification.
Yeah, no, but I mean, it's a perfectly good question.
Yeah, I was and maybe you're going to go on this as well, so I'm sorry if I'm anticipating it, Gabriel, but I think one of the things that's interesting in light of this analysis is the way we define politics, which is a move away from, like, as Gabriel said, like the qualitative logic of like this thing is more self-aware or more intentional or more like expressive of the real desires or needs of the class or the group or whatever, to a formal, even somewhat quantitative notion of, do we actually expand our social world and then reciprocally, like even ourselves or our groups, through our political interventions? And I think that that's essentially like that's the very real practice of organizing in general. I recently came late to a lot of the local organizing around Palestine in the town I live in here. And so I'm coming into a lot of pre-existing conversations, all of which are kind of the classic ones in their, particular local forms, which is different groups speaking past each other in how they're determining what is effective and what is not, where you have entirely different criteria, entirely different assessments of which methodologies should even be kind of looked at in the first place. You've got folks that are continually doing marches over and over again because the reference points that they look at in terms of like excitement, for example, or tightness of the march, those things have been getting better. But other people say things like, well, we're not necessarily growing the numbers, right? So we have these kind of different measurements that are at odds with one another, and there's no real framework within which to discuss what that even means. And I think in maybe some of the more ambitious places in our very humble little project here, is that in a lot of ways, like, we're repeating a certain kind of scientific gesture as against metaphysics, right? Like there is, I mean, one of the classic Marxist definitions of metaphysics is dualism, right? So in another way, one way to put this is we're like challenging the metaphysics that's imminent to left-wing politics, which is this dualism between the political and the social as these different substances. Whereas what we're essentially trying to make the case for is that there's actually a logical difference that is built out of the pre-existing grammar of the social. We do need kind of, just like a higher order logic, we need some extra kind of tooling in order to get up to what we call the organizational point of view. But that extension is not something that is detached from the logical base of social modes, of social theories, which is both this composition, interaction, intelligibility on the one hand, and then the different kinds of interactions that are formed in a society. And I think that, for me personally, like in terms of like just quote unquote being an activist, the ability to kind of like just even sit down at the end of the day and try to translate back to myself what happened with this language is incredibly useful for a lot of reasons, some of which are, I would say, epistemic, but others of which I would say are more like just the existential bullshit of being a leftist, right? Like when you have to kind of distance yourself from all the like pathos of being involved in debates and arguments and all the things that happens, when you can kind of use a framework like this to start to disentangle different threads and different like components, I think you're really able to see see things a little bit clearer. And the last point I'll end on is a lot of where we come from using topology is rested on this idea of like perturbation. Like you kind of have to disturb something a little bit in order to determine what its kind of like limits are, whether or not you stay within the same kind. And I think that that makes a lot of sense to me about how to interpret like Mao, right? Like the moment you start getting involved in any kind of movement and you're asking questions and you're trying to find out what is more or less effective, you're not doing that in a vacuum. You are perturbing, you're participating. That's going to have like mutual feedback effects. That's going to do things, but that's also going to especially if you ask questions well and you have like a communist or kind of theoretical framework to orient those questions, that can often create the space precisely where people start to develop solutions in a way that leads to something that's successful, as opposed to this kind of self-canceling logic that I think is very much has been a lot of my experience of the left, and part of why I find this theory so important and exciting. So I'll end on that.
Yeah, just to, I mean, the next slide is a slightly different topic. So just to add something on what John said, I also think that, I mean, we've been following a lot, a particular interpretation that you can derive from the Communist Manifesto also on what it means to be a communist. So, for example, when you read that classic description, communists they don't have a separate party, they don't have a separate program, so on and so forth. They are the most advanced, whatever you want to take as advanced to mean, part of the different proletarian fronts of struggle, and concerned with seeing the movement as a whole. For us, those two definitions, they are actually very kind of rich, because the idea that you need to be inside a movement, a struggle, and concerned with its connection as a whole, that already sets up the problem that this type of activity is trying to account for. So you need to be able to find what is legitimate and recognize the structure and the organizing force of everything that is going on politically on the left, right? You're not in a position to you don't want to have a strict concept of what it means to politically organize that will remove everything else from the picture. So on the contrary, you need to have a very plastic idea of what this means, but in view of problems of composition, right? You need to think of this in terms of, okay, but where could these things latch onto each other, right? And build. And in that interpretation, that's why I think that this is an interesting point here, that under that interpretation, the hypothesis that, well, there must be a way of accounting for how things are composed, why different things matter for different organizations, and how that's an effect of how they interact and organize. And that this problem is, let's say, the minimal form of the global problem of coordination and transition to a different political system. There is a continuity between the two, because, combining proletarian fronts of struggle and being in a position to build structures to coordinate the lives of proletarian, that's a continuity between communists as exception, right, to communism as a system. Like, those are the two extremes of one common set of problems. So the next slide is about that. But it is an idea, as I was saying, that it's still very undeveloped. But one thing that has happened in the last months or so, I think that has become clearer, is two things. The first is that it's become a bit clearer that we've applied something of Marx's method in Capital to the analysis of these different social logics. So we've used some work that Badiou did with like category theory and topos theory, and we started analyzing Marx's description of economic categories in Capital, and we've seen a certain similarity, structural similarity between the expansion of the form of value all the way to the money form, and the description of this whole complex formal apparatus that goes from categories to pre-sheaves and sheaves and so on and so forth, right? But then that same formal apparatus was very useful when it came to time to understand, well, but what is the logic of gift exchange? What is the logic of property contracts and so on? And even though we could frame the difference between value, property, and affinity in terms of different, very basic different logical matrices. So our hypothesis is that value is an intuitionistic type of structure, whereas property is a classical Boolean structure, and affinity is a paraconsistent structure. So you can keep the same method, and you can get why they vary. We realized that we could also use that same general structure to pose problems at the level of the construction of political coherence, not just social coherence, right? So this slide here, which is very condensed, and in fact, given the last presentation we gave of this at the Common Space of Organizations, I think that we're going to focus on explaining these things next at those meetings in Rio. But what you have here is this kind of basic four logics that we named them after Badiou's theory of what are called logics of worlds, but they have a certain similarity or certain structural sympathy with different moments of Marx's development of money as a universal equivalent. And what we've been studying for the last 3-4 years is that you can actually, to go back to what Leon was talking about with social types, our idea is that these interactive types, you can distinguish them based on these logics, these basic logics. And if you try to derive the consequences for topology, for structure, from using these different logical matrices as the basis for the type of structure that are produced in a topos theoretic sense, you get a lot of properties that look like, you know, a kinship structure, like state contract logic, and like commodity exchange, commodity logic, commodity production. So why did we add this here? Because if this idea that investigation gives us something like the minimal form of cohesion between political parts, right? Meaning, if the type of interaction that it creates is a political interaction, it's not an interaction between something social and something political. No, it's a political interaction between two organizations. And if we're trying to make sure that we account for why that interaction has an effect on what is intelligible, we can interact with, and how things are composed, then we would be right to place it here at the level of a sort of accidental form, right? A minimal form of a political exchange. It's not a social exchange under any of these three logics, which are general logics. They are much more easily generalizable to more and more stable structures, right? So affinity can become reciprocal exchange, gift exchange. It can find material basis to propagate itself through via the way that people interact with ecosystems, how heredity and consanguinity reproduces kinship structures, and that can lead to very big structures. The same with property that can organize into social pacts, contracts, which are stable, cohesive. It can benefit from logistical structures to allow like rights and state structures and so on to be developed. And just like value can go from the simple accidental form of exchange to larger cohesive commodity structures that are actually coherent, right? Where the valuations are coherent. It can use the creation of new goods and the transformation of the environment to propagate those valorization processes and create huge structures that are stable based on world money, capital flows, and so on and so forth. Well, we can place the investigation as a sort of candidate for the accidental form, meaning that minimal form of a political exchange. Why is it qualitatively different from this, while not being substantially different, as John said? Because the thing you're investigating, it's also how these three things exist within a political process, right? But the determinant of what follows the determinant of what you're trying to get from that exchange and how you're going to build on top of that exchange is not just social. You're not just reducible back to, well, but something has a certain monetary value, or this will give us a certain status, or is the law, or, well, this is what we like as a group and we want to push because that's our collective opinion, right? You're trying to override all these social concerns with whatever is the political concern that appears in that investigation. So that's why I'm leaving these two things here empty, because we don't know what are the regional or expanded ways of connecting several investigations, right? Again, making a bit of an analogy with the expanded form of value, right? Where you would have a certain organization being expressed in a series of potential connections, right? We don't know what the material basis for propagating this would be. So what type of forms of reproduction of life or forms of dealing with environments with other things which are not necessarily political? What are the things that propagate this political cohesion? But ultimately, to think about a global or worldly logic that can give you some new political measure for the whole political space, that's where the socialist coordination problem and socialist planning problems come in. So again, I'm adding this, even though it's still underdeveloped, just as a sort of highlight that there is, this keeps this continuity alive between this very minimal type of engagement or interaction and this broader, more classic communist discussion and problems, right? But again, I understand that this might be totally underdeveloped as an introduction to our approach. It's just to give you that idea, right? I'll just go over these two slides and then we can stop, perhaps like just take a break, and then once we discuss, I can go over the examples that we have of this, things that we've been doing that fit the bill of this type of inquiries. But yeah, I mean, Renzo solved it there, but yes, perhaps, right? Meetings, investigations, assemblies, councils, strikes, communes. Yeah, that sounds like it. Yeah. So I think it's good to distinguish inquiries from investigations, right? To use the distinction that appeared in that comparison between Mao Zedong's approach and a more European approach of workers' inquiries. We can think about inquiries as this type of political exchange or political encounters that are centered on knowledge, meaning it is information that you're ultimately after. I think that if we totally just try to sell the idea that inquiries, like you're perturbing the state, and one of the side effects is that you get to tell who's who, like you're going on strike and suddenly your work colleagues, you find out that they're snitches. Well, the perturbation that the strike produced did tell us something about the world, about the organization of your work environment, right? To call that an inquiry would be a bit, perhaps a bit kind of a strange use of the term. So perhaps we can separate inquiries as encounters that are based on production of knowledge, which is a more canonical kind of use or classical use of the term, from investigations more generally, where perhaps you're solving problems, as Mao would say, right? Rather than, and that will produce some knowledge, but that does not necessarily the core of it. So distinguish inquiries as encounters centered on knowledge from investigations as political encounters between organizations, right? And we define the investigation as a form where the encounter between the organizations mutually reveals organizational aspects that are not immediately intelligible for those organizations involved, right? So it would be something that has this structure here, right? Like you have organization 1 and organization 2, and the composition, interactive, and intelligible, right, structure that this produces on this and the inverse, right? They will lead both of them to see each other in a different way, this is not either how affinity works, it's not how property works, this is not how value works. This is something slightly different because those three logics are here as well. They're part of how these things are composed. They exist in a certain communitarian, lawful, productive environment, right? And they challenge this in different ways. This one challenges more segregation and communitarian differences. This one is more focused on going on strike and fighting for better wages and so on. Well, this will affect how they see each other, right? An investigation is a situation where you get this perspective. That's why it's not necessarily, you wouldn't call like an action that perturbates the state or perturbates a factory an investigation, because this is much more the tendency. This tends to happen much more within the political ecology of the left, right? Even though it's not necessarily the case. But you get a certain form to this structure, right? That produces these kind of alternative pictures, right? So that's a first hypothesis for how to define the inquiry, the militant inquiry. And I also think that the other thing that's crucial here is that there is something about mutually revealing something, right? In the sense that you lose that qualitative distinction where one organization is asking the questions and the other is getting the answers. Even if that's the case, for example, in the stuff we do in the common space of organizations, we are the hosts and other organizations are the guests. One thing that is very clear, and once we get to the examples, I think we'll discuss that a lot, is that half of the effects of an inquiry are more about the discussion about your own organization than about the other's organization. So it is really like, throwing two organizations one against the other. They decompose and you get to see what they are composed from that kind of that process, right? That kind of experiment or whatever. So because these two things do contribute. So depending on how you are organized, for example, depending on how the common space of organizations is structured, it will interact with these organizations in one way rather than another. And you will get to learn different things about them. And through the things you get to learn about the others, you also learn about your own limits, because you find out, for example, that it's very hard to discuss racial politics within the left if the group that is asking the questions is just composed of a couple of white guys. The composition of the organization will affect how that encounter takes place. So it goes both ways, even if it's not a symmetric thing where both are getting something that is of the same quality, right? They're structured differently. They have different goals. So you shouldn't expect they'll get the same thing from that encounter. So the challenge of investigations defined in this way is to extract from these encounters the means to connect these organizations to each other, right? So given that you see something like this, right? And this creates a certain division that you get to see something about how this is organized, and you get to see something about how this is organized. Okay, is there a connection here that perhaps was not clear here? There might be a connection at this level of what was revealed that wasn't there before, or might this have the space for connection with a third organization that previously there was no connection here? So producing these types of connections, that's actually the core of this, right? It doesn't need to be a connection at the level of information or intellectual clarification. I'll stop. Yeah, no, well, the other thing that we were thinking about is that then perhaps we can divide this theory into three types of things, because you could call like organizational experiments when you produce this type of encounter inside of an organization. For example, you can have a part of an organization producing this effect with the organization as a whole. For example, say you have, no, this organization one is actually inside a bigger organization. And you produce an interaction here where you find something new about this group, but you also find something new about the organization it belongs to. So you might perturb something or change something in the way you do deliberations, or who gets to participate, or where are you gonna, meet, or how that's organized. So whatever, and that can lead to novelty inside the organization, and we would call that something like an experiment, in the sense that it does produce, like it does create a perturbation in a kind of controlled space. It happens in the interior of the organization. We could call interventions, which is more common type of, like the most common type of investigation, which is when the encounter happens between a political organization and its environment, right? So in a certain sense, it is contained in this bigger environment, and you're interacting with it, you're outside. So for example, it's a political group interacting with the state, interacting with workplace, interacting with different communities, and so on. So that could be treated as a case of the theory of investigations more generally, right? And then you can have what it's usually called inquiries, but perhaps this is where the name investigation could also apply, which is when it's a matter of an encounter between two political organizations, right? So you have organization one dealing with a certain outside space, and you have organization three, and it's this meeting here. You could call this an inquiry. You would call this an intervention, and you would call these type of things here an experiment, right? But it's just a terminology just to help show that the theory is pretty plastic, right? You could be on the lookout for this type of minimal structure, or this type of political exchange thought of as a type of encounter, right? And look for how it affects the organizations that connect to each other. Well, but that idea can be generalized. It's a typology that actually allows you to recognize a very general, subtle form below very distinct type of political strategies and engagements, from more interventionist groups that are more centered on their own structure, groups that are centered on connection with other exactly. There's a scale problem there that this might also help to deal with. So what we have to present after this, I think we should probably take a break, and then it can help us lead the discussion. We have 5 examples from either STP or the Common Space of Organizations that I think fit the bill of either absolutely explicit or almost implicit attempts at working through with these ideas in mind, right? Our engagement with that student occupation in Vienna, our current engagement with the Communist Caucus in the United States, then the 3 militant inquiries that we've carried out in the Common Space of Organizations, with the Invisibles, then with the Popular Revolutionary Action Group, and more recently, last week, with the Workers' Party. But I think that we can probably discuss this after a short break. I know I just went crazy with the presentation. So perhaps like we take a 5-minute break, perhaps. Okay, so I'll be back in 5. Hey guys, is everyone back? Yeah, so just I think people are still coming back, but we'll just share the screen again. I just added here some notes. We didn't have a chance to discuss this in detail. So it's just some pointers to facilitate just talking about them and how these things went. Just to give an idea, I think, of some of the these experiences thus far, right? I think that, I mean, I added here examples that I think fit the idea of militant inquiry in this sense here, right? Of inquiries properly. But if what we're saying here in this typology makes some sense, we could actually, you know, with SDP, we have ample examples of experiments as well. So there, and if what we're saying here makes any sense, it should also be something we can add to the same basic framework and work on those things also under this framework, right? But yeah, so these are just some pointers to facilitate making some remarks. I mean, a lot of people here, I think, I'm not sure how many of the people are present here because Dennis is not here, but some people were involved. Fernando is also not here, but some people were involved with the meetings we had with the students from Vienna, and I mean, Rafa is here and Vitor is here. So if you guys also want to pitch in on some of the stuff we're learning from the inquiries we're doing at the common space of organizations, right? But I just added these pointers to facilitate kind of going over some of the examples, and I think that some of them would actually deserve like a whole meeting just about them, so we can give you guys more context for people who don't know. But just to start the conversation, right? I think that the first situation we went through in SDP that actually kickstarted the conversation in a certain sense, because we were contacted by these students who were occupying actually a private arts university in Vienna. The context is it's not very simple. They were motivated by a larger political movement in Austria that was kind of promoting small strikes and interruptions and general perturbation of the peace due to climate change actions and the presence of either, I don't remember now, of a climate conference or some debate that was taking place in Austria. There was a precedence of a university movement that had been organized a couple of years before around this theme, and they were rallied by these questions to get together, discuss politically different topics and so on. And from that, it developed that they occupied a space inside the university. But they were, I mean, they contacted us at that point. They had been using the space and occupying it for, I think, a month or so. And they just said they read the text that we wrote and they wanted to talk. So it was a very informal type of meeting or encounter. And we met with them for, I think, about 2 months, 3 months, in a very kind of scattered and irregular way. And it was a very kind of confusing first experience because it wasn't clear what was expected from us. There were meetings where we were trying to offer them like some theory stuff and discuss concepts and so on. Other meetings where we were more inclined to ask questions and get them talking about what they were doing and how things were going, and using the space to update us about different developments, decisions they were making. And I think we ultimately followed them for about 4 or 5 months. And there was a specific and important break in this process because it was near the end of the year. So the university was closed for Christmas and New Year, and they had the decision of whether they would stay throughout the kind of winter break, or if they were going to kind of disperse and try to reunite later on, what type of interventions they could make. And I think it was our first experience of, that's why I added this here, of the difference between representation and actual organization, in the sense that it was a situation where what we, from both sides, actually, right? I thought of this actually as just meaning one side, but actually meant both sides, that what they had to tell us about what they were going through originally had to do with not only the problems at their university, but bigger problems to the point of revolution, to the point of climate crises and things like that, which was very different. Like, those are very broad concepts that cover much more than the domain of things they can interact with, right? They could interact with the university policies, perhaps, with other students, with faculty, with the administrative body, and so on. But they didn't think what they were doing in terms of those actors or of those kind of other entities, right? They originally thought of, at least they brought us something very broad. And we, on the other side, also began by offering them something very broad. If it was like a conceptual discussion about how to think about things in general, things like that. And slowly it moved away from that broad discussion to the much more fine-grained discussion of what can you actually do, how do you evaluate the actions that you can take, the small problems that they had to face, small in comparison with these great ideals, right? In terms of the things that they actually interacted with. So, for example, one thing that I think was very interesting to think about became for me kind of a minimal example, right? Is that they conceived the space, they represented the space they were acting in as by the word capitalism. So the word capitalism should describe where the occupation sits. It sits within capitalism. It's trying to deal with capitalism. Those are very big words: capitalism, climate change, so on. And they don't necessarily discern, right, what makes a difference to you as a group of people occupying a university, right? Questions of, is the university public or private? What type of power do you have? What type of things you can force? In which ways are you yourself trapped in the limits of what you can do, and so on? Those things disappear under those broad terms, right? And bringing that back to the level of, let's say, finding the words or the political language that was closer to the realm where they got to actually interact with things. And I mean, it goes just all on thinking about social cascades, right? Things that affect things that affect things, and so on. Yeah, but even your own idea of how an action can have a consequence, right? Because when you talk about capitalism, either nothing makes a difference because it's so big that any small gesture has no meaning, or you can inflate your gesture as if, well, if I treated, the other person nicely, or if we took out the garbage, insofar as that's different from what usually happens, that difference will make a difference. So you just inflate the power of actions to make a bigger difference, right? You simply lose track of the level at which you can measure and evaluate the force of your actions. So on the reason why I think this was a good example to me is because at the end, at the moment that they had a decision to make, do we stay through the winter or do we leave? And that decision was a concrete, complex, and political decision, because for some people, the occupation was a place they got to sleep that was cheaper than going back to where they lived, which was far away from the university. For others, going back home was easy. Meeting their family, spending the holidays, and so on. That decision is very, very small. in the sense of it compared to capitalism. But it is a political decision in the sense that we've been working with the concept of politics, which is the set of kind of justifications for action that are irreducible to value, property, and affinity, to decide that it's meaningful to question if somebody who you know very little about gets to sleep in the place that you're forcing an occupation. You're not in an affinity relation with that person. You might not even like them. That's not necessarily something that concerns property, because your claim to property there is very tenuous, and it's also not a matter of value, productive production, or so on and so forth. But it's very small, and if you look at the things that actually matter, right, it's kind of an ironic comeback of climate, because the actual weather mattered. It's much easier to stay if the weather is good, because they had no heating, than to leave, right, during a warmer time. And it's much harder to stay if it's cold. So you could see that when you found a point of view that highlighted the organizational challenges that they had, they appeared more political than they thought. But, I mean, perhaps less political in the sense of they had very big ideas, but they did have an irreducibly political claim. They were strangers. They weren't friends before they started occupying the place. They got to know each other because of the occupation. They discovered the kitchen of the university, and they started conversing and creating connections with the people who worked at the kitchen. But the things that actually made a difference in their environment, so in the environment of their organization, didn't match with the things that they thought made a difference in this large-scale representation of the world, right? So is it cold or not? That was a meaningful trait of the world for a political decision. So it was ironic to rediscover a concern with the climate at a very, very small level compared with a big level, but it was there in a very strange way. So I think it shows that there is a distinction between how organizations represent what they do, and there might be good reasons for them to represent the way they do. Because, for example, perhaps if you don't tell yourself you're contributing to the revolution, it's harder to have the motivation to occupy the university. And that's not an illusion, right? It just might mean that the connection between what you're doing and revolutionary politics is much more tenuous than the identity you get from claiming, the feeling of superiority you get with regards to your fellow students because you're the revolutionary and they're not. So you can still account for why the representation is what it is from an organizational point of view, but from the point of view, different things appear as meaningful, right? You get a kind of change in the field of what makes a difference that at the same time gets a much clearer sense of the points that truly matter in what they were doing. And what was, I think, another lesson from this first point is that I think it was the first time that we thought about the idea that, well, sometimes organizations think because they started out planning their goals in a certain way, the moment that they cannot reach their goals, that they are meaningless or useless. But it might be the case that while you're going in one direction, the interaction with the world gives you certain features that prime you to act politically on a different direction. So they thought they were an occupation. A lot of things actually go against that idea that they are a good occupation, politically speaking. Occupying on a private university gives you very little power to argue. You need to have a lot of force and a lot of structure to be able to actually push the university in a different direction. They are not obliged to do it by any real reasons. But in the meantime, people who came from different backgrounds, immigrants were getting in contact with, Austrian students. They were getting in contact with the administrative body who was siding with them. They got new contacts with the people who worked the kitchen. All those things could lead to an organization that could survive its own failure as an occupation and become, for example, a student organization focused on the work conditions of people who work in the kitchen of the university. something like that. So sometimes you build things that you don't know what they are for, because you're so trapped in the representation you create of your organization that there might be a greater capacity for connection, in the sense that we were discussing before, in a dimension of what you're doing that doesn't really converge with what you want it to be, right? So I think it's also a good example of that. We did have a chance to talk about these things. At the same time, I think that it was pretty clear that there was, though it's a bit retrospective, I would say, that there was, that the meeting aspect of the investigation is a really big challenge, because getting people to meet, to discuss, and how they meet. So will whoever feels more comfortable speaking hegemonize the conversation? Should, you know, if you're trying to clarify organizational features, is talking to a representative of that organization the best way to do it? Like singling somebody out and getting their perspective. On the other hand, having big meetings with big groups from different organizations, is that much better? So the form of that encounter, I think we started thinking about this type of problem when we met with them. If you wanna learn about the features of another organization, and you want to be able to think about, well, what's the most conductive or conducive kind of environment for that type of perspective shift to be possible? Is it an encounter with a bunch of people from an organization you don't know? Well, they'll be reactive. They will not know much about us, right? There might be a lot of different noise sources in that interaction. Is that a problem? Is that a good thing? How do we deal with that? So all those things about how to give form to that kind of meeting, I think, appeared in that first encounter. The other example we have from STP is something that's still ongoing, which is our romantic engagement with the Communist Caucus, which is the communist, one of the communist lines inside the DSA. They do a lot of work with tenant organizing in the United States. They looked us up because they produced a political analysis that had a lot to do with our own take on what we call peripherization. They have a text called, I think, Proletarian Disorganization, and they wanted to talk about that. Fatima, who is here, myself and Dennis, we went over to one of their meetings and we gave a presentation about some of STP's ideas. They'd agreed to come to one of our meetings this year and present a bit of what they are up to. And the idea is to develop a project together, either this year or moving towards next year, where we can actually, they can find a use to the type of thing we're developing, but we can also get a continuous and steady engagement with another organization to try out these ideas, right? And one of the things that I think we learned, when, again, a bit retrospective, is that this is not an inquiry per se, right? This is not an encounter of focused on learning something about how they're structured in this kind of minimally asymmetric thing, because we want to get the knowledge and they might not want to get anything out of it. This has from the beginning been thought as a type of political exchange, where they recognize as legitimate the type of work we're doing. They're interested in pitching in and exploring these things together. But we've also been faced with the challenge of finding our place inside an organization's political language, in the sense of what type of insertion do we need to produce inside the Communist Caucus activities, strategies, and so on, so that we're not just a foreign body in this exchange, but it made strategic sense for them to be engaging with something that perturbs their space in a way, right? And what type of perturbation could be produced that would be beneficial, in the sense that we tension their actions in a direction that clarifies interesting things about their organizations, but also gives a new role to the type of things we do. So I think it's an example of something that is slightly more symmetric or egalitarian, right? Which is definitely a vocation of this type of investigation as well. Doesn't need to have that kind of some are asking questions, some are giving answers type of structure. But it's something that is still very much in the beginning. We're still talking to them. Joe, who's our main contact in the Communist Caucus, we're still thinking about when is the best time for them to join us, to present. But it's an ongoing process that has that very, very much that structure. The type of questions we've been asking, the type of issues to solve are very much inside the theory of investigation we're talking about here. It's a matter of producing a type of political exchange across organizations that are structured differently with different political goals, but with the expectation that through that political exchange, you can find points of connectivity to create a certain type of consistency or composition that otherwise would not be possible, right? And that does play a further role in that connection, because the Communist Caucus is exploring the tendencies, the hypotheses that this is, which is a similar hypothesis to ours, that this type of challenge is going to become more and more common. The more social forms go through the process of what we call peripherization, which is the conditions of peripheral countries tend to reproduce themselves in the countries that are more central or supposedly advanced. So very heterogeneous social formations where legality and illegality, slavery and wage labor, very negative forms of affinity are mixed with positive forms of affinity. That type of very hybrid space, that tends to expand in the world rather than be kind of reduced by the expansion of a more homogenized social form. So the more that type of form, heterogeneous social form, expands, it follows that political processes that politicize those spaces become fragmented themselves. And it follows then that the problem of composing political fragments become even more common. So they are not just intellectually interested in what we're discussing. I think they are ultimately interested in the theory of militant inquiries as well, even though we're actually, you could say that this is itself a product of the interaction with them as well. And then it comes to the three inquiries that we carried out in the common space of organizations, right? That's why I distinguished them. I think that I'm not sure what Vitor and Rafa wanna add here. I just added some basic things that I think are important. I think that the first inquiry we did with the Invisibles, the Invisibles, which is a movement that Vitor helped to create. It exists in more than one state in Brazil, and it organized. I always forget the word. Every meeting I ask this, like, how do we again call terceirizados? Fucking hell. Outsourced, yes. Outsourced workers in public universities. So sanitation workers, security guards, administrative bodies that are just outsourced and hired through a company. So they organize outsourced workers, and they mediate that type of organization through the promotion of journals that publish anonymous complaints from those workers about work conditions and so on. And I just wrote here that it's an example of an inquiry that opens space for the organization to think, because I think one of the interesting things that happened out of that original meeting was that the movement was kind of at a halt at that point. We brought together for the discussion members of the movement from different cities, and I think it was a positive effect that it did create a new kind of it contributed to create, a new situation inside the movement, where after thinking it through, discussing with each other and so on, it picked up some momentum again. So that's I think a possible effect of this type of activity, where that encounter might not necessarily create a great connection between STP and the different movement, but it might create new connections inside the movement, because you get a chance to talk it through, hear other militants' opinions about why things went wrong, where the limits were, and this can change things, right? I'm not sure if you guys want to say something about it. I don't want to like don't want to over explain how that meeting went. But the other point that I wanted to say is that I think it was the first answer we had to this problem here of, well, what's the good form for that meeting? Well, one thing that we applied in that first inquiry was the idea that, well, we should try to avoid having one person speak for a political movement. And just by having like 2 or 3 militants from a movement, preferably coming from slightly different places within the movement, so kind of highlighting that it is composed in a certain way, right? In this case, Vitor, who is here, Vitor and André represented the movement as it happened in Goiás. Zé Antonio, who was a third person, represented the movement as it happened in Rio, where he participated most. You could see that there were very different relations. Zé and Vitor are closer than they were to André. At the same time, André is still in Goiás and Vitor moved to Rio. So there were a bunch of dynamics amongst them that clearly made the conversation different than if we only had one person. And I think one way of thinking why that's different is because you get the chance, and I think that Vitor highlighted this very often, that, and for me, that's the basis of this very idea here, of thinking that the inquiry is actually an encounter. Because even inside this organization here, what we did, right, is to have 2 people speak. I'm simplifying rather than 3, but 2 people speak. Why? Because this way you get one description, you get another description, and you can look for invariances in this description, right? Either because things vary too much, so they say different things that don't match at all, or because you get things that both people say, even though they're coming from slightly different perspectives. In between the 2, you start getting a feel for the organization. That is not just the report itself, right? So that very idea that you get a certain clarification about an organization from the fact that it's an interaction between structures, we reproduce that inside the organization we invite itself by asking them to give multiple accounts of the same thing. In this way, you don't need to trust any account. You don't need to overly focus on any one account. And one account clarifies things about the other that the other person didn't think about. So I would say even that, in this sense here, you could say that this is Invisíveis Goiás, and this is Invisíveis Rio. And in a certain sense, you had this inquiry inside of the inquiry, right? Because inside the movement, you got 2 parts of the movement relating to each other as organized, and that revealed things about them that wasn't necessarily clear beforehand. And that's like happening inside of the inquiry itself, where this is the common space of organizations and this is the Invisível. So I think that, that idea that you are constantly trying to create a comparative frame, right? You're looking for something that is invariant by varying, right? You get 2 organizations, therefore variation, and then you find something invariant, which is not necessarily the structure of any of the 2, right? Something that is kind of revealed by that encounter. Well, that idea applies to how we structure the inquiry, how we invite people, but it explains the inquiry itself. It's the same type of principle, right? I never thought about that. I just thought about that now, like, because we had a similar justification for why we had more people to the investigations, like why we invited more people from from one group, but I never realized that it actually has that resonance with the bigger kind of structure. And then I think that we then invited the Popular Revolutionary Action group, which is a movement inside of a party called the Democratic Workers' Party, PDT. They are a nucleus inside of the party trying to push it more towards the left. It's a center party in Brazil, but it has a more left-leaning history. Exactly, Victor. Yeah, exactly. So it just goes to show, right? If this theory is correct, it perhaps is the clearest at the level of political composition across organizations. But insofar as organizations are heterogeneous themselves, it actually seeps into more grounded levels as well, right? It can be a theory of meetings, not a theory of inquiries, right? Perhaps what I call experiments there, we can even distinguish like meetings from experiments, from inquiries, from interventions, and so on, and add this vocabulary as sharing a common language, right? So the Popular Revolutionary Action inquiry, it was a very different one. First of all, it was the first of these three inquiries. The first one, Vitor, was both part of CSO and part of the movement that it was being investigated, right? And the Popular Revolutionary Action, that wasn't the case. And that created a situation that we hadn't experienced before, which I just added this one point, but I think there are other ways of framing it. Because one thing is that they didn't know who they were meeting. So who is the common space? What do we want? And I think it's not a bad thing in itself, because sometimes when people don't know who they're talking to, you get to see a bit about, let's say, their fantasies, so to speak, right? Their kind of preconceived model of who people are, and that can be very meaningful information. So in part, that was the case. They seemed very eager to talk about political philosophy. They clearly thought we were researchers interested in that type of thing. But at the same time, it created a very interesting situation, because while they were presenting, sometimes they would stop the presentation and pick up a cell phone to record a part of what they were saying. Like, I think Fernanda even distinguished three types of interactions, right? Sometimes they were just talking to us. Sometimes somebody was talking and another person would get the phone to record. And sometimes they would ask us before saying something, are you guys recording? So there were things they didn't mind being recorded, but they weren't recording. There were things they were purposefully recording, and there were things that they didn't want to share beyond the room. As a point of principle, we never record anything that we do in these inquiries. I think that it's also a way of highlighting that type of activity is not meant to produce information, produce images, produce discourse. It's meant to produce political connections. So things will endure if things endure. If there is no connection, if there is no sense of dependency between movements created, things will just disconnect, right? So we don't record. Also because that changes how people speak and talk about problems and so on. But it was very, very interesting to see, partially because they didn't know who we were, that they were also constantly trying out defining who their addressee was, right? So sometimes they would tell us like just things they would clearly tell anyone on an internet interview, things that you say to a general public about what you believe, what's important, where the organization is heading, things that are really like indifferent to that encounter there, because they would tell it to anyone. So it's almost as if there's no one in front of them, right? It's bypassed by the encounter with this abstract public they're trying to reach. And sometimes we manage to bring these things back to that situation, right? I even think that, we didn't discuss this, but I'm not sure what you guys think. I even think that the times that they asked us to not record, like they were going to gossip about problems, they were going to gossip about, you know, contradictions or people who are corrupt in the party or whatever, they were also mistaking what made a difference to us. This is like the moment that they asked not to record weren't the moments where they said the most meaningful things, in the sense of things that matter to understand how they are organized. That was also a weird offshoot of kind of this kind of general idea they had about where they were and who they were speaking to. The things that interested us were much more connected to, again, just as with the student occupations, like if you remove all the ideological clutter that people say that what they want and what they believe, how are they actually doing things? Who gets to do what? What are the conflicts that this produces? I remember Victor asking very kind of wholeheartedly at some point, like, I come from an autonomist movement. Like, one of the things that we are constantly concerned that it's a subjective conflict is the fear of being a pelego, right? Like being somebody who is like a sellout rather than a revolutionary. What are the type of conflicts you guys go through? And then they were just quiet, like, no, we don't have any conflicts, we don't have any problems. It was very funny. No, we're fine, we're great. But it was a lot of things were interesting for us that they didn't care for. So, for example, they started talking about how they got to join this particular center party. Like, why did you guys decide to join this party, right? And the story was very interesting. It was about people doing occupations as students in a kind of autonomous movement. They got traumatized by that experience, and they said, we'd never want to self-organize again. We want hierarchy and structure. And there are other aspects that are very interesting to consider as well. But clearly there was a continuity about an organizational thought, you know, about explaining why things went wrong. So things didn't go wrong because of the police, because of snitches, because of, you know, the precarity of the autonomous movement and the hardships. Things went wrong because there was a lack of hierarchy, and they wanted to achieve similar goals by being inside of the party and influencing public policy and being able to support autonomous movements. So that's a thinking about where things went wrong, why they went wrong, and what makes a difference in what they do now, right? So it was interesting also to try to steer that conversation away from this kind of broader address, right? It's almost like there was something like this. They are here, and it's like they are addressing some abstract outside, right? And I write this as a dotted line because it's also abstract how those things should matter. Like, why recording? Why telling others about your ideas, people who don't even know? Why is this going to help you? It's unclear, right? Perhaps they have an explanation, like, oh, but our point is we need to get to the masses, and once they know our ideas, they're going to join us. Once they join us, we're going to grow. Once we grow, we take over the party. I don't know. But regardless of that it seemed like there was a work to bring this back to this interaction, which wasn't like we discussed a lot, like how should we intervene in that meeting to allow this to happen, to remove a certain conversation from an abstract realm of ideas to the actual interaction that we were having with them there, that could lead to them needing things from us and vice versa. We're always inviting organizations who come to do the inquiry to return in a later time to do another one, to participate in other political movements inquiry. So trying to make that kind of move away from an abstract, easier, costly, less costly connection to a more complicated but more real, concrete interaction with whoever was there, right? And then I just added here the third movement, which was our inquiry last week with the Workers' Party. We didn't discuss this at all collectively. Like, we didn't do like a balance, like a, how do you call this? Like a, you know, we just didn't sit down and debrief after the meeting. But so I just added here some things that crossed my mind, and just from quick conversations with Rafael, Fernando, and Victor. The first thing is that one thing that was very clear from the interaction with them is that they had an objective with us. Like after the inquiry ended and we talked and so on, you know, they were asking like, okay, who's gonna join the party now? You know, like not in a duplicitous, manipulative way, but as a sort of quid pro quo, a sort of, well, this is an opportunity for you to accomplish something which we are not even exactly clear what it is, but this is also an opportunity for us to expand an agenda, right? And later at the bar, clearly there was a moment where they were just like getting their phones and asking like, "Can we just? Do you want to join?" You know. And even during the meeting, I'm not sure if you guys agree, but I felt like perhaps we could make that distinction between moments where we did manage to touch on organizational problems of being a militant in the Workers' Party. For example, the very interesting problem of, you know, political part, the Workers' Party, as some other parties, they pay some militants to be full-time militants, but that's a non-regulated type of employment. Like it's a very indirect and strange type of employment, and it has absolutely no perspective. Like there are no career perspectives, nothing. So you're kind of freed up to do a lot of political work. Or sometimes you're exhausted because there are no limits, no bounds to that, no regulation to it. And also you don't want to leave that position, because if you leave that position, you have no work perspective, right? So there was a very interesting discussion about this, and a lot of things were clarified about how this works in the Workers' Party. But at the same time, there were other moments where they were clearly just, it's not that they were giving us the public speech that you would have like somebody on a you know, pulpit, like just preaching the party line. They were telling us problems, but also trying to make sure people understood that it's not that bad as people say. It felt to me afterwards like there were some things that were directed at us as CSO in an encounter with us, and some things that were directed at the public who was present during the meeting, who were being engaged as potential recruits. You know, I'm not sure if that's something that you guys agree with, but I had the impression that that was perhaps one of the dualities in the way that they presented things. You know, sometimes it was a lot about the success they had and how they are aware of the contradictions, but the party is very much the home of those contradictions. It's a place for everyone and so on. And it is a kind of a prudent, self-aware discourse of the limitations and so on, but also with an effort to make it welcoming, versus the moments where they were actually following a thread of something they were thinking at that moment while we were there with them, you know? Not sure what you think, Papa.
Yeah, I think like what stood out to me, and this is something like Gabriel said, tomorrow is the day for trying to get these ideas in a more organized form. But I think one thing that stood out to me was this duality between, there is like an impulse to join the movement, and once you are, which was like the because it's very connected to the imaginary of the Workers' Party in Brazil, how it changes people's lives. And then when you get inside the party, you are, due to the party structure, a bit disconnected from what changes people's lives. You know, it actually reminded me a bit of the popular revolutionary action in a way. And I think like when it seemed to this, like, I don't think this was something that was like it wasn't one of their spontaneous moments, you know. I think like this is something that comes with the seduction, with the you know, like this is something that will give you ease, rest, you know. I think they insisted a lot on this point, and it's very interesting because there's this difference between self-justifications, you know, how you commit to the stuff, and like what the party structure promises them, and at the same time, at the end, like the different, and I think this is something that we took a while to get by, which is how actually there are certain commitments and sacrifices that are also very much common to other types of movements, with autonomous movements. And so in a sense, I think that like there was this difficulty in us, and I especially think due to the fact that we are learning and things in how we're doing, to get a sense of what kind of commonalities we can find within our baggage of inquiries. I think this is something that's very, very important, you know. Well, that's just what I wanted to chime in.
All right, can I go ahead? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So I've been taking some notes here and like thinking about what Rafael said at the end, to think about the baggage of militant inquiries that we have. Two militant inquiries came to my head. The first one, the meeting that we had in Beirut in 2022. It was like a talk with Gabriel, who is
It's a good example.
yeah. So there's, okay, I read my notes. So one example of militant inquiry is the meeting we held in Beirut, in which organizers and militants from different groups came together to discuss like the experiences we had during the uprising of October 2019, after the economic crisis in Lebanon. And like these people came from different militant groups, feminist bloc, other political groups that engaged in the elections that happened afterwards, and like the Communist Party and so on, and even like lone wolves who just like organize and vibe with politics and so on. And the other meeting we had earlier, and Yumna was one of the organizers of this meeting in Palestine, Free Palestine Front. It was a meeting in which members from the Salmidoun collective, okay. So another example is the meeting between Free Palestine Front in Lebanon with organizers and Salmidoun Group, a collective of militants who came together amidst the Zionist aggression on Lebanon in 2006. They worked in supporting displaced families from the south and southern suburb of Beirut. And what was interesting in this group, it wasn't like doing mere humanitarian work. It was more in coordination with the resistance. It was like a form of popular resistance and steadfastness. And like thinking about these two meetings, it seems like in the first meeting in 2022, which came after the uprising in Lebanon, it wasn't clear to everyone why we were meeting and why what is that we need to be doing. Although the engagement in the sense of number of people who joined the meeting and spoke during the meeting was noticeable. While in the meeting with Salmidoun and Palestine, Free Palestine Front, which happened earlier during the ongoing genocidal war in Gaza and the escalating war in South Lebanon, threatening to expand and intensify, it seemed like the sense of urgency and necessity played as a political awareness. And it wasn't like something that is going and is not noticed, as in the case of the first meeting. What I'm thinking about is that I'm not sure, I don't want to put the spotlight on Yumna, but I'd like to have this conversation even after this very late meeting. I think it would be interesting.
Left.
Oh, okay. Okay, so I'll talk to her later, but
But
I
this
think
would
it
be
would be
amazing, huh?
yeah, to reflect on experiences in different political groups, such as the Lebanese Communist, like she was in another communist organization. I was in the Lebanese Communist Party. And also there's like other collectives such as the Queer Mutual Aid, the students groups in Tripoli and Beirut, the collectives that work on campaigns and marches in response to certain stuff that are happening in the country. And it would also be interesting to organize meetings between these groups. I'm not sure how like it would be, let's say, facilitated and more moderated, but like we can try to do so, not because this is how we need to organize ourselves as communists, but it can still tell us something about how we tend to organize and recognize the obstacles and articulate our failures. Might have something to add to the history of communist struggle and basically use this meme. And I think this is important because the knowledge of, or the political intelligibility and clarity might help us make more sense of what has been accomplished and what is to be done, or worked through at least. And this in itself is a form of resisting and challenging the channeling, that's a good slip, channeling our dominant narratives and challenging the dominant narratives within the left itself, not only like and like here, of course, understood as people who consider themselves as leftists or engaged with politics or like political and social organizations. And this engagement and interaction might allow us to see something that we have missed, like by standing in different point of views and so on. To be honest, I'm a bit confused about distinguishing what is political and what is social. Here's my intellectual insecurity coming out, but you know, what makes a difference between what is political and what is social organization in this sense? I understand that it's not important to like you know, the interaction in itself is you know, what we tend to focus on. It doesn't matter if a group represents itself as political or not, but I'm wondering, as from the organizational point of view of, let's say, STP, yeah, I'd like to hear more of the comrades. And yeah, I think, you know, this whole kind of engagement might help us have something to add to the last chapter. We'll start working in the chapter from the end.
From the back, yeah.
Yeah.
You know, this is just to add something, because I think you raised an issue that we also discussed in the meeting here in Rio. I think I don't remember who raised it, but somebody asked like, yeah, but you know, inquiries seem too much focused on getting information, and most political encounters are justified because there's something to do, not because like, let's meet, let's have a meeting. And I think you good. It's a really good concrete example. The two meetings you compared, the recent meeting in Beirut, right, versus the meeting with the Free Palestine Front. One is more kind of obscure. Why? And the older one has a very clear, urgent task, right?
And I think like this distinction comes from the fact that like everyone who joined the first meeting, I'm sorry, there's sure passing. Yeah, so everyone who joined the meeting during the one we held in 2022 shared this sense of political paralysis, let's say, or like not knowing what is that we need to be doing, or while you know, being under a lived threat earlier, a few months ago. Also, like made people more aware of what brings everyone together, and like yeah, everyone in the first meeting was like feeling alienated from one another, while in the other meeting everyone felt like there is something that we need to be thinking about and doing together.
I think that, I mean, this is something we still need to develop, but for me, it looks like it's a difference between these two things, right? So let's say you have an organization and another, and they're meeting, and this is one space and this is another space. But you can have also one organization meeting the other where they are like this, and there is like either a common thing here or a common thing like this, which is not the same, right? Like the big one is we're actually part of a bigger thing. And this one here is we're very different, but we have one common task, right? In the case of this little thing here, what is an encounter, right? Is when you create a set that is built of just those two things. What is the encounter? It's just this thing here. What does it contain? Just this and this, right? In these other senses, no, like it contains the organizations that met plus the common task, or the organizations that met and other things that are not present because we're both part of something bigger, right? So there is something similar to the two, but there is also something very different. And I think that I wonder what you think of this, Fatima, because sometimes I feel we expect that because there is a common task, that there will be a composition almost automatic. And sometimes there is not. Like, because there is a common threat, people get even more alienated from each other. So every group thinks they got the threat right, and everyone else is, for example, playing the enemy's game. You know, so it's not true that every time they get together because there is a common background. You know, like, I'm not sure that makes sense.
I'm thinking about like in the second meeting between Free Palestine Front and Samidoun, or members, like a few members from this collective, the one who founded it, and like it lasted for a few months, and it was active in different areas in Lebanon. The thing is, what was really interesting is that they said that they introduced themselves and they recognized themselves as being a part of the resistance movement that is at work. So they formed the popular resistance in alliance with the military resistance that is taking place in the south and on the front. So and like Free Palestine Front in itself is a movement that, although like there's the strikes or the marches like aren't huge, there's not like thousands of people coming, there's usually a few tens of people, but the thing is that they do recognize themselves as being also a part of this resistance movement. So I think that there was the encounter where two organizations were present, but also both of them were aware that they are a part of something bigger. And the thing is that it was an inquiry because like Free Palestine Front invited Samidoun to talk about their experience and to have people ask questions and learn more about what the obstacles that they faced, let's say with the fascist groups in Beirut, problems with, I don't know, theft or racism or any disturbances that might happen in shelters and so on. So I don't know if this like speaks to what you were saying, but
No, it definitely does. Because, you know, I think that this situation here where, which I think is the minimal situation, right? One organization meets the other and you don't have anything else other than just that encounter. That's, let's say, the minimal, weakest form. But for example, if you have a common measure, so anything that shines a light on both of them, you can use this to construct a common language. It can be like an enemy, it can be a problem, it can be a task, it can be anything that both of them recognize. And then you can build on top of that a common language to do something. It can be like a fragile language, because as soon as that particular problem disappears, they have no connection. It can be a stronger one because both of them start acting differently because of that. It can be many things. But it just goes to show that this structure here, this is precisely this thing here. Fuck. It's this thing here. It's moving from a very weak thing to something that has some expanded coherence, right? It's not gonna end once the connection is over, right? Or it's similar. That's why I think the analogy is strong. Like if this is just an organization encounters another, and it's kind of like a commodity is exchanged for another. Expanded form is like you can have many connections. One commodity is like this amount of this, like there's a list, right? And in this case here, like a problem creates a bunch of organizations. Now they have something in common in light of that problem, right? There is something similar. I think what you're describing is a good example of the difference between an inquiry as just this, okay, we don't know where we are, let's meet and find out, to, okay, we found a common measure, we found a minimal thing that can show what we have in common, right? And it can be very restricted. It perhaps is not like a worldview. It's not like a general strategy. It's like very small, but it's already an example of this move here. So for example, we could even be a good direction for where investigations need to go. If investigations really have to do with this whole problem that goes from just finding out where we are to coordinating a global communist revolution, the first step is moving from one organization talks to another to finding things that allow us to put a bunch of organizations in a series, right? So I think what you're saying is an example of this movement here. It would be really good to discuss this more, like especially if there is like a concrete example we could explore, you know. It's a great topic. We could talk to Yumna if she doesn't want like to have a meeting only about that. Like it would be amazing.
And why I'm thinking about that is that because like we've been having these conversations like in the light of the ongoing war about Lebanon as a country and the Palestinians and the Syrians in Lebanon, and how the left has been organizing over the past 70 years or so. And I think like this kind of inquiries is something that has been like missed, and yeah. So I'm just like excited about it, and let's see.
Yeah, I really think that this could go far. And also I think what you said, something that we should explore later, which is I think has to do with what Vitor said here on the chat. Like sometimes the social conditions facilitate the creation of common problems. So for example, I think that, just to give an example, right? In a nice welfare European country, if you have like a problem, a social problem, because the society is very homogeneous, it affects the whole left at once. Because a work problem is a problem for the feminist movement, is a problem for the workers' movement, is a problem for the students' movement. So it's easier to find a common task to create that situation. When you have social catastrophe, peripherization processes, fragmentation, the world doesn't facilitate creating that one common task. the tendency that when you find one task, the student movement thinks about it one way, the communist movement thinks about it another way, the students think about it a different, the feminists think, and then it's harder to, rather than creating that serial structure, it splits them apart. So, like, you know, we could even analyze the political economy connection to that problem. Like, one thing might influence the other, you know, how easy or hard it is to do it.
I think if you look at the problem at like the point of view of political reproduction, it's like I'm going currently through a strike in my working, like in my workplace. So like in the union life, when it's low mobilization and it's business as usual, it's like the optimal condition for political reproduction of the collectives that compose the union movement is low participation. So the collectives, like, they do stuff that repel participation and they maximize conflict between each other because they're like competing for a decreasing number of militants, either taking militants from the other group or like trying to decrease the space for the other collectives to mobilize. And when there's a strike, it's like this becomes impossible. So they have to compete to look appealing to a larger force that's like forcing these political collectives. It's like if they behave as usual, they may lose much more than when they had a conflict in a normal situation. So I think that's what I wrote there. It's like when the social conditions change, it's like how a political organization like sees that change and interacts with it. It's you can see stuff that wasn't visible at first, and that it seemed like a crisis or something, but when I have to think a bit more. Just...
No, but yeah, but I think that there's definitely something there. But like, I think this is a really good question that connects what you're saying with what Fatima said. Like, under which situations, like, what makes a difference that in some cases a strike will invert, right? The organizations are competing, they're different, and then the crisis brings them together. But other types of crises don't do that. They do the inverse. They could actually come a bit closer together, or they could be a bit contrasting, and then the crisis makes them even further apart, right? Like, there is something about the social situation that can lead to one thing or to the other.
Yeah,
That's really cool.
it has to do. I think it has to do with like the increase or decrease of like what we define as political. So when a part of the social world becomes political, a part that wasn't, it's like it forces organizations to meet. When the political is decreasing, it's like they have to struggle to survive against each other somehow. So it's like they're competing over a smaller space of the social.
I just to use this as a, I mean, I know we need to finish the meeting, but just to use it as a reason to respond something that Fatima said also. I think that this distinction between social and political, I mean, we try to make it a bit more complicated because we can distinguish between social, emancipatory political, conservative politics, and reactionary politics. Like, all those things are different, right? It's not just social or political. Everything political is good. No, but there are also reactionary politics, right? Or conservative politics. So I think that a good way of thinking about that distinction, just for the sake of facilitating, right, is when you can explain your behavior or what you want to do or where you want to get to, simply by talking about community, and affinity, or property, you know, or value, that's a social behavior. That's so Why do you go to school? Why? I want to get a job someday. That's a justification that just talks about state affinity and labor, right? I just want to get a job, so that's why I'm going to, or it's what everyone does. I don't want to be in a bad position with my parents, something like this. That's a social justification. When you're doing things that are irreducible to that type of description, so and it doesn't need to be like because of the revolution. It can be something like, why are you doing this? I don't know. Like, it's just trying it out or whatever it is, but it's now hard to explain. There's something else that is not just social reproduction of your life, of career, of your tastes, your preferences, or anything. It enters into a different space. Now, that space can go in three directions. I'm doing something that is outside of my individual social life because I think the world should be bigger, more things should exist. That's what we're calling emancipatory politics. That added justification is pointing towards more things that are not allowed to exist having a right to exist, right? You can have a conservative politics, which is saying, I need to do this unexplainable thing, which is not just for myself and not just for my social standing, because very important things about the world are threatened to not exist anymore. Customs, order, tradition, whatever. You're trying to conserve things you think are threatened not to exist anymore, right? And reactionary politics is when you do things that are not your social or individual life for the sake of reducing the world, because you think some things should not exist, right? I'm acting because I think somebody should not exist, some social group should not exist, some territory should not be recognized. Like, you're trying to reduce the size of the world, right? Conservative is trying to keep it, it's doing an added activity to make sure nothing changes. That's why it's ultimately the same as reactionary politics. It leads to reactionary politics, right? So, I mean, it's not a perfect description, but it's a working way of talking about the difference, right? That doesn't imply necessarily knowing where things are beforehand. Like, if a really good way of seeing this is, well, if you're organizing with comrades, with others, and they say, what you're doing makes no sense, don't do it, this shouldn't be done, this group shouldn't have legitimacy, you shouldn't exist, you learn something, right? Of course, this is not the same as, like, if you're in favor of oppressors not existing, you're actually in favor of more things existing because oppressors are reducing the size of the world, right? So if you want, Israel not to exist as a state, you're not, oh, I want to reduce the size of the world. You're actually wanting to get more things recognizing to exist. So it's not like you can't apply this blindly, just looking at the words, right? You need to look at the effects, but at least it gives you a distinction, I think, right? Not sure if that helps. But...
It helps a lot. Yeah. I have few scattered ideas to throw here, but like you said, there's conservative politics and emancipatory politics, but like through the conversations, I've been thinking about how would we think of the work that has been carried out by many NGOs that tend to represent itself as being engaged in some form of political activism, and I'm wondering if there's something in our theory that might touches on I don't know, terms as activism and militancy, and I don't know if this has something to do with what is social and what is political, and I'm thinking about conservative politics masquerading as an emancipatory politics, and this
Perfect.
discourse, the human rights and so on, and this humanitarianization of the Syrian crisis, So you look at the Palestinian cause as something that is too political, that like you're just too afraid of engaging with, while the Syrian cause is basically mostly framed as something quite humanitarian.
I'm not sure what you think, but I think a good way of talking about humanitarian depolitization is that it's a conservative politics that wants individuals to exist, but doesn't want to open space for political groups to exist. So it says we need to save lives. That means we want to recognize that individual humans exist. So let's say you can, doesn't that make sense, perhaps?
Yeah, I wonder here if like this speaks to the fact that like many struggles are restricted in the legal aspect of it, that doesn't allow for a political change that would basically change the laws and so on. And here, of course, we can think of Palestine and so on. So
Yeah, I think a good example of this in the humanitarian sector that I'm learning is that, for example, if you can prove you are individually in need of help, they can fund you. But if you are organized into a group that is politically fighting for the very same right to exist, they don't fund you. So if you're an individual who needs to be conserved in life, they say, okay, you exist. We want you to exist. But if you say, no, I don't want to exist, I want to politically fight for my own, they say, no, but that's too much. Like, we don't want to bring anything new into existence. We want to prevent people from dying.
like this is exactly what is happening with the airdrops, food airdrops, and not opening the crossing.
Exactly. But I mean, the day that became clear to me was when I read the history of the humanitarian sector, and they were like at the origin of a bunch of these NGOs, big NGOs. It's the story of oligarchs in rich countries saying, we want to bomb these places, but we can't allow people to die because we need them to work, because they work in our factories. So like, we need to bomb them, but they cannot die. Like, and the humanitarian sector exists to conserve individuals without creating collectives. That's I think a good definition. Like, the NGO sector, the only collectives that should exist is the NGO, and everyone else should be an individual, right? Civil society. So I think, I mean, we should definitely take this further, because I think it can really help with that. You know, again, because it has nothing to do with the discourse. Of course, NGOs say a lot of different things, but in practice, what they recognize as existing and what has the right to exist, right? And ultimately is what human rights say, is that what has a right to exist is individual persons. And we accept that individuals are part of communities, they have rights, and they have, you know, to reproduce themselves materially, but only those individuals and those communities, right?
Like this is the discourse of, let's say, the American Congress, or like the US state. Like they say Palestinians, but they don't say Palestine as a representation.
Perfect, yeah.
Sovereign society. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good example. Like, you can't support Palestinians without supporting Palestine. So it creates a deadlock. But you can't support Syrians without supporting Syria, because Syria itself is not in discussion. It's Syrians who are. Then it's like perfect for them. Like, there is a very polemic article to be written there.
Here, I don't know. I'll throw a crazy thing, but like, I've been thinking a lot about Lebanon as the weird concept. Like, no, it's really weird to be a Lebanese person, because like the fascist discourse, or like definition discourse, the traditional Lebanese discourse is that Lebanon is a country for the Lebanese and it cannot be a country for the refugees, while in fact, this needs to be a country for the refugees, for the Syrians and the Palestinians, to be able to achieve a certain, I don't know, emancipatory or future of a different reality. So like in Lebanon, the discourse is a lot focused on Lebanon as an empty idea, or like, I don't know, but like there's no engagement with the I don't know, Lebanese populations or like the impoverished strata of the population. And I'm not sure if this adds anything, but I think, you know, at some point it might in the future. Because yeah, and always like talking about Lebanon seems very empty because like it doesn't include the 2 million people who are Syrians and Palestinians and who are still struggling to achieve. And like it doesn't also include the Lebanese living in the peripheries in the south and in the north. Like the Brazilian, exactly, like like Tamer what? This Michel Tamer, like, you know, this is an example of what this Lebanon we're talking about. So yeah, it would be interesting to keep this conversation going. And yeah, I think I'll go over the previous recordings and like some of the text we have here.
But I think we should have a practice of just having like schedule a meeting with the team, and then we can just develop, because clearly if we just start speaking about this, we're going to have like interesting ideas. Even this thing about how to frame humanitarianism, I never thought about that, like it, but it makes sense. We could talk more about it
Cool.
in a time that is not like what, 2 a.m. now for you, Tree?
Yeah, it's okay. It's okay. That was really interesting and exciting. We're so back.
We're so, yes, great. Okay, guys, I need to go. I need to cook.
Thank you so much for the meeting. See you next time.
Thanks.
See you next time, Leon. Thank you so much for joining us today too. Hope you join us again.
Bye.
Bye, Travis. See you. Bye, Michael. See you
Thanks,
all.
Leonie and Eric.
Bye, Bye.